Well, hello, everybody. My name is Jonathan Keller, and I am the president of California Family Council. We are one of the leading organizations in the fight against Proposition 3 here in California, alongside my friend Tanner DiBella from the American Council, good friend Katy Faust from Them Before Us, and a host of other organizations, churches, and individuals from across the state of California. If you are not familiar with Proposition 3, you have come to the right place. We are hoping that today's webinar is going to be watched and shared very broadly across our state over the next 2 months. We want to make sure that whether you are a pastor, whether you are a lay leader in a church, whether you're just a concerned mother or father or a voter, we want to make sure that you know why this measure, this constitutional amendment, is really dangerous. And it goes far beyond what you may be hearing in the media. It certainly goes far beyond how it was sold on the Assembly and Senate floor last year when it was introduced as ACA 5. So before I bring on Tanner DiBella and Katy Faust to share their expert opinions and their expert analysis of this measure, I just wanted to step back a little bit and give you a little bit of a history of how we got here. So first off, as I mentioned, the organization I'm blessed to lead is called California Family Council. We're what's known as a family policy council. We're one of 40 state-based groups around the country that fight to defend God's design for life, family, and liberty, in our case, through California's church, capital, and culture. Going back to 2000, there was an initiative that was passed, a state statutory initiative that was known as Proposition 22. Now, Prop 22 was introduced because people were worried, even all the way back then, 24 years ago, about the shifting ground legally for marriage and the definition for marriage. So at that time, a group of concerned citizens came together. They passed an initiative to put on the ballot. They collected signatures, and that passed by a fairly significant margin. At the time, it was, I believe, about 61% to 39% in the year 2000. And that 22-point win coincided with George W. Bush's in the presidency that year. Obviously, he didn't win California, but you did see a large groundswell of Californians of both political parties, of all different ethnicities, backgrounds, socioeconomic status, that came forward to defend the traditional historic view of marriage as between one man and one woman. That is what the statute said. However, just a few short years later, we saw Gavin Newsom in 2004. He was then not the governor, not the lieutenant governor, but he was the mayor of the city of San Francisco. He decided to thumb his nose at the Constitution and thwart the will of the voters and begin issuing same-sex marriage licenses in San Francisco courts. Well, as you might imagine, there was a huge backlash to that. And initially, these courts decided to say, you cannot do this. This violates California law as according to Prop 22. So fast forward a few years later, and in 2007, 2008, there started to be some additional rumblings that the California legal system was poised to reinterpret the Constitution and reinterpret the laws and say that that initiative, Prop 22, because it was a statute, it wasn't part of the Constitution, it was just a regular law, that was no longer going to be applicable. So in 2008, the state of California, ultimately, after they had overturned Proposition 22, our organization, alongside a broad coalition of individuals, churches, both the California Catholic Conference and the bishops of the state of California in the Catholic Church, a group of people from the Mormon Church, Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, Jewish communities, huge components of evangelical communities of, again, all different ethnicities and backgrounds, came together to, again, collect signatures. This time, however, not just to put marriage into the Constitution as a statute, but to put it into the Constitution as an actual amendment to the Constitution itself. And what we thought was that would mean that the courts in California, rather than ruling that the statute was against the Constitution, it would instead say that now you have to interpret all these other laws by the Constitution. Since this is now part of the Constitution, you have to apply it. You have no choice. Your hands are bound, and legal wrangling and judicial activism would not be able to sidestep the will of the people in this regard. Well, it was a much closer vote this time. Kind of remarkable that just in 8 years it went from a 61 to 39 to only a 52-48 win for the definition of marriage. One thing that's notable, just to point out about that time, was at the same time in 2008 that Barack Obama overwhelmingly won the state of California. He trounced John McCain in the polls or at the polls, at the ballot box. But the primary reason why Proposition 8 passed in 2008 was not because of Republicans. They were outnumbered at the ballot box, and if it would have only been a party line vote, there's no way that Proposition 8 would have been enacted. One of the ironies of that election cycle was the increased turnout among church-going African Americans who came out to vote for President Obama. They helped provide the margin of victory alongside evangelical Hispanic voters. Those two constituencies actually made up the difference because if you looked at exit polls among white Californians, the initiative was actually failing, but it passed due to the very broad-based coalition that our organization alongside a bunch of other groups had assembled. And I can brag on CFC because that was before my time. I was not on staff at that point. That was my predecessor, Ron Prentice. It really was kind of a monumental victory when you look back to think that only 16 years ago, California not only qualified, but ultimately passed an initiative defining marriage as between one man and one woman in the Constitution. So over the next 5 years, unfortunately, we saw more lawlessness. We saw activists try to sue and say that for some reason the initiative was either improperly worded or it was too broad or it violated some other parts of the Constitution, so it should be thrown out. Well, during that season, between 2009 and 2010, then Attorney General Jerry Brown refused to defend the initiative or the amendment, the part of the California Constitution. He refused to defend it in state court. Likewise, our governor at the time, Arnold Schwarzenegger, refused to defend the amendment in court. So that left it up to our organization, California Family Council, and a broad coalition to put that together and to push back on that legally. Fast forward to 2011, you had a change in government leadership. Jerry Brown became the governor. He still refused to defend the amendment. And a woman, a former San Francisco district attorney, was elected the Attorney General of California, Kamala Harris. And likewise, she refused to defend Proposition 8 legally. So yes, there is a national political tie-in to this story. So by 2013, after years of legal wrangling, this had made its way to the United States Supreme Court. And I won't get into the specifics of kind of the complicated way in which Prop 8 was overturned. But long story short, because of the refusal of both the governor, Governor Schwarzenegger and Governor Brown, and the Attorney Generals, Attorney General Brown and then AG Harris, because they refused to uphold their oath to the Constitution and defend Proposition 8 and that language, ultimately the Supreme Court said that we and our associated organizations did not have standing. It's a complicated legal thing. It's not the purpose of this webinar. But as a result, starting in 2013, Proposition 8 was struck out of the California Constitution. And now it has been, as a result, essentially dead letter law. It is in the Constitution, but it remains unenforceable and inapplicable, which is why you see California as a destination spot for same-sex marriage, even before the Supreme Court legalized it across the entire country in 2015 with the Obergefell v. Hodges Supreme Court decision. So with that bit of history, that brings us up to our present day. Why would a group of legislators be revisiting a Supreme Court case from either 9 years ago or 11 years ago, depending on which one you're talking about? Why are they so interested in repealing language from the Constitution that has been sitting there for the last 16 years? Well, sadly, there's a very good reason, and it is because Proposition 3 goes far beyond just repealing Proposition 8. So with that, I'd like to bring on my good friend, Katy Faust. She is the founder and director of Them Before Us. It's a wonderful organization based out of the state of Washington, but with not just national, but international reach. He most recently spoke for one of our mutual good friends in the state of New Zealand, who is leader of the Family First organization there. I was a little jealous, Katy, that you got to go with Chloe Cole and to the wonderful Kiwi folks down under. But Katy, I want you to tell at your beginning just a little bit about how you got into this fight, kind of the abbreviated, amazing story that you have. But I would encourage everybody, if you go on YouTube and you just search Katy Faust, you will get to see some of the incredible presentations that she has done, whether it is for the National Conservative Conference, whether it's for the Colson Center for Christian Worldview, whether it's other podcast interviews or speeches. One of my favorite advocates and activists on this issue of talking about why we should be defending marriage, not only for the sake of adults, not only for the sake of scriptural truth, and not only for the sake of religious freedom, but for the sake of children. So, Katy, thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Thanks for the introduction. Thank you for speaking up on this issue. When I understand that it may not be politically advantageous to do so, guess what? Defending kids isn't a political decision. It's a moral decision. It's a Christian decision. It's a decision that fundamentally has to do with justice. And that is how we need to think about things. You know, I got into this first as an anonymous blogger and a stay-at-home pastor's wife mom. And I didn't intend to jump into the most contentious culture war issues that we're facing today. But my problem was all of these conversations, beginning with marriage and now moving on through all kinds of other manifestations of parenthood and family issues, whether it's reproductive technologies or same-sex parents or even the nature of adoption and who adoption is really for. All of those conversations were obsessively focused on the desires of adults, the identity of adults, the feelings of adults, and it was always the kids that had to suffer when we got these questions wrong. That to me was the most apparent when we were talking about the definition of marriage. And that's why I got into this, simply to say, hey, kids need their moms and dads. Mothers and fathers are not optional in the life of the child. In fact, it is fundamental. It is critical. It is a non-negotiable foundation for their physical, mental, emotional, academic, and relational health. You mess with a kid's childhood, you mess with their whole life. And I said that as a woman who had been working with teens and working with kids for the last couple decades, as somebody who was the assistant director of the largest Chinese adoption agency in the world, a mother of 3 biological kids and the mother of an adopted child as well. I have a lot of close contact with kids and what they need to thrive. And I'll tell you what harms them in 100% of cases. When they lose their mother or father, especially because adult desire is being prioritized above their fundamental rights and needs. And that actually is what we're talking about when it comes to Proposition 3. If you are looking at these conversations, what you are seeing is an adult-centric narrative. And that's always how it goes. If they bring the kids in, it might be to say, oh, kids just need to be safe and loved. Oh, kids don't need a mom and dad. They just need parents who care for them. No, they don't. Marriage, whenever we are talking about marriage, we are talking about a fundamental matter of justice for children. We have been studying family structure for decades, and scholars on the left and the right agree that children raised by their married biological mother and father in a stable, low-conflict union have the least amount of barriers when it comes to thriving and success in their future life. That is a non-negotiable. If you look at the demographics that make up some of the greatest social ills that we're facing today, whether it's child poverty, whether it's teen homelessness, whether it's teen pregnancy, teen suicide, high school dropout rates, what you notice is all of those different demographics are overpopulated with fatherless children, overpopulated with kids who are growing up outside of that protective umbrella of their mother and father loving them and loving each other every single day. What Proposition 3 is going to do is cement that fundamental child loss in California's Constitution. Now, that is a problem. It's a problem because we've spent a lot of time over the last decade or so in this country playing around with the definition of marriage. We've said, well, maybe it doesn't have to be permanent anymore. Maybe it can just be short term. You know, honestly, that happened with no-fault divorce, also unfortunate origins in California back in 1969. Well, that removal of permanence, that lifelong till death do us part union has wreaked havoc on generations of children. And then we started to play around with the definition and say, well, maybe we don't necessarily need to have it be a man and a woman. Maybe it can be 2 men or 2 women. That has wreaked havoc on the life of children who are growing up intentionally motherless or fatherless. And now we're toying with, and a couple different municipalities in California have already done this, normalized polygamous relationships. That is dangerous for children, because anytime you have an unrelated adult sharing living spaces with the child, rates of abuse and neglect increase in 100% of cases, whether it is a stepmother, a cohabiting girlfriend, whether it is a stepfather or cohabiting mother's boyfriend. That man is statistically the most likely to abuse and neglect the child. Sociologist Brad Wilcox said the most dangerous place a child can find themselves today is in the home of an unrelated man left to care for children themselves. Proposition 3 is not just going to destigmatize those households, it is going to normalize and incentivize those households. In essence, it says children don't have a right to their mother and father. They don't need their mother and father. They belong to whatever adults have the money and means to acquire them. That's already happening through reproductive technologies, which again, California is showing us the way forward in terms of redefining what it means to be infertile. Now, it's not a medical condition that takes place between a heterosexual couple that's had unprotected sex for at least 12 months and has not been able to have a pregnancy or a live birth. Now, California is saying infertility means you might be single. Maybe you're in a same-sex couple. Maybe you're in a throuple. But you don't have the sperm, egg, and womb needed to assemble the baby. So we're going to subsidize that through state funds and insurance costs. What is going on right now in the world of marriage and family suits adults fine. The adults get what they want. They get their recognition, emotional bonds validated. They'll get the custom ordered children delivered to them through the reproductive technologies. The problem is children are being victimized. They're being victimized when we play around with family, because here's a few things that are non-negotiables. Children haven't changed. They come from a man and woman. They have a natural right to that man and woman. It is that man and that woman who grants them their biological identity that helps children answer the question, who am I? It is the mother and the father love that maximizes child development. It is the mother's love and father's love that children crave every day and that they hunger for when they grow up without it. It is that complementary ways that men and women parent that maximizes child development. And it is a child's own mother and father who are statistically most likely to ensure that the child will be safe and loved. Those realities don't change. They were true 2,000 years ago. They'll be true 2,000 years from now. They were true during Prop 8, and they are true during Prop 3. The question for all of us is, will we understand and recognize and respect these fundamental realities of children, or will we victimize them? Because we would prefer to give adults what they want, and we would rather have our social acceptance and be on the quote unquote right side of history so that we can be invited to the right kind of parties and we don't have to alienate the people that we want to be chummy with and be on the wrong side of kids. That's really what you're talking about when it comes to Proposition 3. Are you going to stand with kids, or are you going to transform what has historically been the most child-friendly institution the world has ever known into just one more vehicle of adult fulfillment because you don't have the guts to say kids deserve their mother and father, and marriage historically is the way they've always gotten it?
Wow. Well, yeah, I don't have much that I can really add to that. And this is one reason why, Katy, I'm so glad that you were able to join us, because even the name of your organization, I just want to highlight that for people in case they missed it. It is them before us. And the entire idea is that my favorite things that you say is that adults should be the ones doing hard things for the sake of children. We should not be forcing children to be doing hard things for the sake of adults' feelings and desires. And in other words, we should put them before us. And I love the fact that you continually help us remember that and you center that as part of our discussion and reminder. So we'll have a little bit more time to do some Q&A, but I'd like to shift now and bring in Tanner DiBella. Tanner is a good friend, a little bit of a newer friend, but we've known each other for, gosh, Tanner, I'm thinking it's been 4 years, like this month or last month with the COVID lockdowns and everything. We met during all the craziness of everything happening here in the state of California in fall, either August or September of 2020. And at the time, he had just launched this amazing new organization called the American Council for Evangelicals. And he was also a pastor on staff at Destiny Christian Church in Rocklin, California. So Tanner is also a graduate of, I'm going to get it right, I didn't write this down, Tanner, but UC Davis with his degree in political science.
That's correct, yeah.
Okay, I got it. He has become a really dear friend over these last several years, and he is one of the leading co-authors of the ballot arguments that we submitted to the Secretary of State's office earlier this year to push back on Proposition 3. And again, something that, as Katy pointed out in her discussion and as we've pointed out in the ballot arguments, Proposition 3 is not just occurring in a vacuum. It is not just a happy-go-lucky situation where we're going to take out outdated language. It's not just removing language that is ineffective. It is a repeal and replace that has drastic consequences. So, Tanner, with that, I don't want to steal your thunder. I know you have a presentation to put together, so please go ahead and take it away.
Yeah, thanks, Jonathan. Appreciate it. When we look at Proposition 3, I am a pastor, like Jonathan said, and so I can't talk about something like this without bringing in a spiritual component. And Katy alluded to this beautifully, in the reality that the family is the most important institution created by God. God created 3 institutions: civil government, family government, and church government. And without getting political, I think it's really clear that we have seen over the last number of years the civil government, the state, attempt to redefine much of what the church is and does and can do in society. And so it shouldn't be a real shock to us at this point that we're seeing them try to do this to the other institution, the oldest institution in creation, and that is of the family. And so I'm going to go through kind of Proposition 3, the misnomers, but really the biggest concerns. And both Katy and Jonathan kind of alluded to these already, but I want to get into some of the meat of that. The generalization of the text. Looked at ACA 5 when it was in the state legislature. Funny, you look at some of the bills in the legislature and they're long, hundreds of pages. And you see on my screen, this is the extent of Proposition 3. This is its entirety. And the problem with this is it provides virtually no parameters or boundaries. California has a history of doing this, and there's a clear purpose in doing this. But the language in Proposition 3, by being so general, by having such loose language, leaves room for wide interpretation and loopholes. And if you look at the bottom here, ultimately what it does is repeal Section 7.5, Article 1 of the state constitution, which defines marriage as a man and a woman union, and adds in that article Section 7.5a, which basically says the right to marry is a fundamental right. Now, on the surface, we would agree with that. But the problem with this generalization is there's no definition to this. And so looking at this, Jonathan and I look and see, okay, there's really 3 big concerns, which Katy talked about these at length already. But you have child marriages and incest, polygamy, and ultimately the health of the child without a mother and a father in the household. And so first, when we look at child marriages, interesting looking at the rebuttals in those arguments, Jonathan, because we're kind of made to be this, it's the strategy of anybody left in California is we're crazy conspiracy theorists and the things that we're saying have no tether to reality. But all of these have really clear implications and consequences. So like I said, Section 7.5a says the right to marry is a fundamental right. You didn't know in California, underage marriage is not illegal. I know that's surprising. Currently, there is no penal code or constitutional amendment that protects underage marriages. And this was true back in 2017. There was an assembly member, Katy, that tried to end child marriages and introduce this piece of legislation. And in an opposition letter, the ACLU said that the bill unnecessarily and unduly intruded on the fundamental right of marriage. So when we hear the phrase fundamental right to marriage, that should set alarm bells off because of its use in legislation history in the state of California. And so because there is no definition of marriage in Proposition 3, anyone that analyzes can come to the conclusion that this could open up doors to more underage child marriages. Right now in the state of California, children are able to get married with consent from their parents. This basically takes that away. And we know the implications of this. There's multiple areas of research on child marriages in the United States. 50% are more likely to drop out of high school. 31% are more likely to live in poverty. We know the damage that child marriages have on children. And yet Proposition 3 loudly and proudly moves some of those protections from children and allows this untethered, unaccountable child marriage reality to continue to grow and expand in California. Another one is polygamy. This is one that I've heard a lot on social media, rebuttal to our rebuttal in Proposition 3, that this is fake news. Polygamy is illegal in all 50 states, and this is not a reality at play in Proposition 3. But it's not far-fetched. Katy alluded to in her discussion, Oakland and Berkeley in the latest cities in California to approve polyamorous relationships. And it's important to know that in California, there is a Penal Code 281, that does technically criminalize polygamy. But the problem that when you look at this is we know that the state and federal constitution supersedes any local or state penal code. And so while there might be some protections in the state of California against polygamy, we're seeing anecdotally that in other cities, they're just refusing to obey that outright. But then when you look at Proposition 3, it takes that restriction away, because we know that the state constitution supersedes any penal code that would be in the California justice system. And so this clearly opens the door to polyamorous relationships in the state of California. And then something that Katy talked about that I'll just briefly mention because she did it so much more justice than I could, is this reality of a two-parent home. Proposition 3 removes protections of this. Section 7.5 of Article 1 of the Constitution says currently that only marriage between a man and a woman is valid or recognized in California. Now, as Jonathan alluded, we know that it's a moot point. It's not enforceable at this point. But this section 7.5 would be repealed under Proposition 3, and all it says is a fundamental right to marry. So this recognition of one man, one woman in the home, a mother and father, goes away. And we know this. Parents are considered to be the most important people in a child's life, development, and identity. And what Proposition 3 does, it increases the risk of what a household without a mother and father look like. It increased the risks of mental and physical health of a child. We know this. 63% of youth suicides are from fatherless homes. And so when we look at California as it continues to try and redefine the church, and now we're at a point where it's trying to redefine the family, it's not about a what if. Right? Proposition 3 came into being because the state legislator said that we are concerned that SCOTUS is going to remove these fundamental rights of marriage and that California will then go back to that Section 7.5. It's a moot point, and we know it is. And ultimately, when you look at Proposition 3, it's nothing other than a shade structure that's attempting to redefine the family and open up the door for more debauchery and more depravity within the home. And that's why this is so damaging, and it's ultimately a concern. Regardless of your religious affiliation or political affiliation, Proposition 3 is anti-family and it's anti-kid. And we have to make a bold statement and a bold stand in this moment to bring truth on what Proposition 3 will do to families in California.
This is something that for a lot of people, if you are hearing this for the first time, you are probably a little bit shocked because, as I said in the introduction, the way that this has been discussed in a lot of op-eds or endorsements in the newspaper or on media sites, it's being discussed as, oh, this is just, easiest vote ever. All you got to do is think the Proposition 8 was 16 years ago. It's been overturned. We don't need this language in the Constitution anymore. We can just easily get rid of it. Now, I will say, despite the fact that California Family Council were the original proponents of Proposition 8, if Proposition 8, if all this was doing was excising that language from the Constitution, it would still be bad. We would still oppose it. We would still think it was fundamentally wrong as a matter of philosophy, morality, religion and social science, we would still think it was wrong. However, the actual day-to-day impact of it would be relatively negligible because, as we've discussed, it hasn't been enforced. But as Tanner pointed out, the fact that this is a repeal and replace dramatically changes the impact of this proposition. And a few days ago, Katy and Tanner, I was doing some interviews with Los Angeles Times and the San Francisco Chronicle. And one of the reporters asked me, I don't understand why you guys are making such a big deal about this. If you look at the Legislative Affairs Office, the group in the state of California that analyzes pending legislation, or in this case, a pending constitutional amendment, they said, well, this isn't going to have any major fiscal impact on the state of California. So no big deal. Thumbs up. We don't need to talk about any potential second order consequences. And I respectfully told the editorial staff, I said, with all due respect, I think that the Legislative Affairs Office has a failure of imagination because the potential impacts of this in so many different ways are, all you have to do is consider what could possibly happen regarding, let's say, state mandated benefits. If you have the state that is offering some sort of financial aid to college students because of their marital status or because they are the children of a married couple, that could dramatically change if all of a sudden one income earner now, instead of you're talking about a 2-parent family with 2 children, what if we are talking about a 12-parent family with 18 children? How does that change those types of things? Also, when we've talked about this with some of our friends at Alliance Defending Freedom regarding child custody, if you have 4 or 6 or 8 people who marry each other, but then they adopt children or they are now legally granted full rights, they don't even have to adopt children because the marriages, quote unquote, these polygamous marriages allow children to now belong to all the parents. What happens now if parents divorce and you don't have 2 divorced parents, but you have 6 or 8 or more divorced parents? Who gets the custody of children? Birth certificates. Already we have changed birth certificates in the state of California to say parent 1 and parent 2 because saying mother and father was insensitive, according to the legislature, to same-sex couples. Again, that totally disregards biology. It disregards the actual genetic relationship between a parent and a child. But what happens now if a birth certificate doesn't say parent 1 and parent 2, but parent 3, parent 4, parent 5? I mean, again, the level of chaos that I think is going to result from this being enacted is almost too hard to explain. So with that in mind, I know we only have a few minutes here before we have to wrap up. Katy and Tanner, I wanted to find out if you had any closing comments or any closing kind of charge to the people who are watching this, whether it's a pastor watching this and saying, what can I do? How can I defend God's good design for marriage, number one? Or as a voter, how can I respectfully share these points? I'm not a philosopher. I haven't studied this. I don't run an organization, but I want to talk to my friends across the backyard fence, or I want to talk to my friends at work about why Prop 3 is bad, why redefining marriage is dangerous. What are like the best takeaways that we can give them?
Well, I think that the fact that this is a matter of justice for children has got to be forefront of your mind. Let me ask you this. When was the last time you heard a government official in California or a national government official say kids need moms and dads? When was the last time you heard that? Not even kids have a right to their mother and father, but that they need a mother and father. My guess is it's been about 9 years. You know why? Because when you redefine marriage, you redefine parenthood. Those two things go together. When you make husbands and wives optional in marriage, you make mothers and fathers optional in parenthood. That certainly is the case when we think about our cultural conception of family. Now we have redefined marriage in the legal concept by taking away mother and father on birth certificates, putting parent 1 and parent 2. You have overhauled your laws in California according to the dictates of Obergefell to now say that the Uniform Parentage Act means that any man or woman or couple or throuple can acquire children created through reproductive technologies with no kind of genetic connection and no adoption screening for them. Children have become accessories for these adult relationships. And so what you're about to do here is a further obliteration of marriage, a truly next step of the redefinition of marriage. And I want to make this connection very, very clear. You will never redefine parenthood from the perspective of the child. Their mother or father is never optional in their life. They will always need their mother and father. They will always only get their genetic identity from that man and that woman responsible for their existence. It doesn't matter if they have 2 fathers or 10 fathers, they will always crave a mother. If you want to redefine marriage, just be very, very, if you want to vote for Proposition 3, just be honest about it. I would rather have kids suffer than for my social status to suffer. That's the trade that you're making. For those pastors that are out there, speak clearly, speak boldly. Because when the world shrinks back and redefines God's definition of this institution, it is always kids who pay the price. And you, Christian, especially you, Christian leader, are charged not with making adults feel good. You are charged with child protection. God's design for sex and marriage is plan A for child protection. Whenever we step away from that, kids suffer. Sometimes emotionally, oftentimes physically, sometimes because it will destroy their life in a way where they can't even function, and they are susceptible to all these social ills that Tanner mentioned, that I mentioned. If you truly believe in justice, especially for the least of these, you don't give 1 inch on the topic of marriage. You might lose friends. Welcome to Christianity.
Amen. Preach. Tanner, any closing thoughts or comments?
Yeah, I would just end by saying to Christian leaders, know what the church is meant to be and do. The Apostle Paul said that the church is the pillar of truth. And we're in a moment where, as a pastor, seeing all of my friends in the spiritual circles in California, I'm heartbroken at the level of disengagement on issues that have nothing to do with politics. This has absolutely nothing to do with the institution of civil government, of law. This is about the family, and Katy beautifully described it this way. And so as the church, as the pillar of truth, what other responsibility do we have in this moment than to defend the truth? People are looking to the church in this moment for a glimpse of hope, for a glimmer of truth in an atmosphere that is soaked with deception and lies. And so as the church, we should be standing up for children. We know what the family is. The mission statement is in the Bible. We know its purpose and its function. So let's be bold about it. Let's be compassionate. Let's be kind, but let's be bold and unwavering in what the family is meant to do. The government does not get to redefine the family. Only God gets to define that institution, and we cannot allow any other outside entity to redefine what God has created.
Amen. Well, folks, I want to again thank our wonderful guests, Tanner DiBella and Katy Faust, for joining us on this special webinar. I would encourage you, please share this webinar, whether you're watching it on Facebook, YouTube, Twitter. Please reshare it. Text it to your friends and family. Share it on your Facebook page. Share it on Twitter or X. Post it on TikTok if you're into that. I don't have TikTok, but for the rest of you, go ahead and do that. I just encourage you, even just email it around to people and let them know the consequences that are on the ballot this November. This is not just another proposition. It's not just a throwaway bit of legalese cleanup. It is a fundamental shift and demolition of the most fundamental human relationship that we have. And I'm grateful so much for our friends Tanner and Katy for joining us. I encourage you to go to their website. You Google them before us, or if you Google the American Council for Evangelicals, you can find out more about them and the great work they do. Of course, our website, californiafamily.org, and the website that we are building, there is some stuff on there now. We're going to be adding more arguments and more resources in the next few days, is proposition3.net. Proposition3.net is where you can go to watch this video. You can share it. It's an easy link. You can say, go here and watch this video about Prop 3, proposition3.net, and we will have links to both Katy's website and Tanner's website there as well. So, folks, God bless, and thanks for being here. We'll be back soon with another California Family Council webinar.